ונתחזק בעד עמנו ובעד אורי אלוקינו ונתחזק ביד עמנו ולמען הרי אלוקינו חזק חזק stand as one חזק חזק we must be strong חזק חזק we will go on יעשה שלום.
Without further ado, let me get into what is, I guess, the 8th lecture tonight of a series of 14. The lecture series entitled The Ben-Gurion Era at High Noon, Israel and the Jews, 1957 to 61. And tonight, as I say, we're doing the 8th one, entitled Sitting on a Time Bomb, Israel and its Arab Citizens in 57 to 61. This is obviously a very sensitive topic. And that's very much part of the Israeli reality. Maybe you want to look at it, maybe you don't want to look at it, but nevertheless, it's a very important part of the Israeli reality. And let's see if we can bring some light to the subject. I start by pointing out in 1949, Israel had 156,000 Arabs at the end of the war. 156,000. Today it's 1.7 million. Okay? Listen closely. There were 950,000 Arabs living in the area that became the state of Israel before the War of Independence. By that I mean very specifically, here's the old map of Israel before 67, what they call the Green Line. So I'm not talking about the partition lines. I'm talking about by the time the fighting was over, what Israel was able to get in 48-49 war. So this is the old map of Israel. In this area of the old Israel were originally a little less than 1 million Arabs, 950,000 Arabs. So if all was left was 156,000, so 800,000 fled or were kicked out. Get it? It's a large number. Now I'm not talking about from the West Bank, and I'm not talking about the Gaza Strip. Not the Arabs that were living there. I'm talking about the Arabs that were living, you understand what I'm saying, in Israel proper, who were not living there by the time the war was over. This is why you have all this big stuff today with the right of return. It's a large number. In 1949, Truman and Atchison, this is right after it, when Israel became in, forced Israel to take back 35,000. Okay? It's a certain episode that I talked about in the past. You don't have to remember everything I said. In fact, you don't have to remember anything I said. But the fact is that at 156 plus 35, so you're already talking about 190,000, just like that. You had another couple thousand, so it's, it's close to 200,000 by the time we're finished in 1949. This was forced on Israel by the United States, by Truman and Atchison, as part of what they thought would somehow or other lead to some kind of a peace process, which it didn't. Ben-Gurion and Sharet basically said never again, because Israel got nothing out of that, and it didn't satisfy the United States. They were taking it enough. And so we run into a basic problem that is still with us here in 2015, right? Which is it's not enough, it doesn't solve anything, but on the other hand, people want to see mobility, movement, flexibility. Most of the Arabs in 49, majority, live in the Galilee, but many also live in the narrow waste, which is a security nightmare. So here you have the map of Israel. Look where I'm pointing over here. And I know you've all been in Israel, so when you drive, it's very narrow here, correct? Some places it's 9-10 miles wide. And I know you know what I'm talking about, because whenever you go on a tour, they drive you up the coastal highway, and you look on your right and see these big Arab towns. So they were smaller at that time. They weren't as large as they are today, but they're right there on the waste, as they call it. So it's talk to me from a military point of view, from a security point of view, from a trying to control the frontiers point of view, and you'll see what I mean when I say that if you're talking about the Galil, that's one thing. If you talk, because if somebody's living here, right around Nazareth, you're not at the border. But if you're living along here on the narrow waist, for example, you are at the border. Okay? Now, the Arabs, realizing that they've been shafted by circumstances, swear allegiance to the new state of Israel. And here's a typical ceremony. Now what that means is that here comes 1948 or 49, because in the negotiations with Jordan, with King Abdullah, in 49, when they made the final armistice agreement with Jordan, ending the war temporarily anyway, in 1949, part of the deal was that Israel insisted that Jordan give a strip of land, what's called Wadi Ara, not too far from Haifa. So that means Israel took over in 49, in addition to what I'm talking about, a strip of Arab villages. And so here comes the Israeli army, whether it was in terms of conquest, like in Nazareth, for example, in 1948, or it was in Al-Fahim and places like that you perhaps hear about, which are large Arab areas, in 1949. And what are the Arabs supposed to do? They say, well, this is the new reality. And so they do what they do ever since time immemorial. He says, okay, get along with the new, if the Jews are now in power, the Jews are now in power. So they all swear allegiance, as is to the new state of Israel, because if they don't swear allegiance, that'll give Ben-Gurion a chance to kick them out, right? He'll say, I can't keep these guys in, they're going to be a fifth column, right? So they all swear up and down to do so, but do they mean it? What do you think? Now, the Arabs are there, but Ben-Gurion doesn't want them. It's a natural fifth column, as he calls them. You understand? It is only natural, Ben-Gurion feels, that they should want Israel to be destroyed. So I'm going to be using tonight the term Ben-Gurion a lot of times. And I don't necessarily mean him himself, although I don't not mean that either, but I'm using that term as a sort of one-word code for the entire Israeli security establishment that he erected. It's Ben-Gurion and his guys, the guys followed his policy, or sometimes he followed the policy that they recommended to him. So I'll be talking about this as I go through tonight, but you understand what I mean. They call in Israel Gormei Bitachon, which is the security establishment. It's the army, it's the Shin Bet, it's the police, it's this group, it's that group, but it's the ganze cluster, as they say. Now, the attitude, therefore, of the Israeli government was a Ben-Gurionist attitude, which was very hostile. We suspect the Arabs will shecht us if they have the chance. It's only natural they don't want us. Nobody talk goody-goody. All right? Now, again, they're there, but he doesn't want them there. So he gave up from day one on the idea of winning the hearts and minds of the Israeli Arab population. They hate us, and that's how it's going to be. Such is the wide consensus in Israel. I repeat, the wide consensus in the public in Israel during the Ben-Gurion era. So here's Ben-Gurion, here's Martin Buber. Martin Buber would represent a very marginal, tiny group in Israel, university professors, poets, people like that, who say, no, this is the wrong attitude. We're all brothers or cousins, and what we should do is, now that we Jews, for the first time in history, are on top of someone else instead of being the oppressed one, we should go out of our way to be ultra-liberal to them and create unprecedented opportunities and give them total access to power and all the rest of it. And Ben-Gurion said like this, those are nice words, but this is the Middle East. It's not the Midwest. You understand? And so there you have the attitudes. The reason I mention this is because I'm not sure today this very wide consensus exists. Maybe it does right now because of the events of the last 2 or 3 years. I think the Gaza war, the kidnapping, and things like this have pushed the population more in a, shall we say, a right-wing direction recently. That's what the polls seem to indicate. But it is true, Yosef, can you hear? He said, see, what is true is that there have been shifts, and there's a much stronger left, if I can use that term, in Israeli politics since then, and at the time I'm talking about, there wasn't, okay? Now, what I mean to say, therefore, is that Ben-Gurion has these attitudes, but on the other hand, he is a Democrat, and I repeat that. With all of his mishigasin, he was a Democrat. The Arabs are citizens of Israel. It's not an apartheid country. They can vote. There's no such business as 2 bathrooms, 2 water fountains, and all that kind of things that you find in a genuine racist country. You get it? The Israeli law from day one prohibits this, and still does. So it's usher, legally, in Israel, to discriminate against anybody on the basis of nationality. I don't say they don't do it, but it's but same thing in America, right, or anywhere else. Things happen, but as far as the legal system is concerned, it's completely prohibited by the laws of Israel from day one. I just want to be very clear about that. But they hate us, and they'll kill us if we're not always on guard. That is the attitude of Ben-Gurion and his guys. And so his goal was, and I'm going to be cynical over here, to attain the effects of apartheid without the laws and without the racism. So basically what he means is like this. I don't want them living among us. I don't want them in a position where they can make a bomb. I don't want them in a position where they can move to the neighborhood and mess it up, because they'll come in and they'll take over. I want them not in my face. I want them not to have weapons. I want a situation in which the Jews are clearly the ones in charge, but I don't want to do it through laws, right? But I am opposed to racial discrimination or ethnic discrimination in principle. So if it sounds a little bit funny, it was funny. There have been democratic countries, including the United States at one time or another, that have had these attitudes, and this is part of the history. But what about in the long term? Well, Ben-Gurion figures, if there's ever peace, that will ease matters. You know, in other words, this is a temporary situation. Hopefully the Arabs make peace with us. Now, he didn't believe they'd make peace in a million years, okay? And he actually died very pessimistically, you know, but it'll never happen. Because as Ben-Gurion said, why should they? If I was them, I'd fight till I destroy Israel. But if they do, that will ease matters, and especially the Arabs in Israel have a higher standard of living, and he figured that'll win him over. So that, let's just pretend right now for a moment. Suppose Israel really made a peace with the Arabs. Let's say they made a peace with the Arabs. And if they did that, so you'd have Arabs living in Chutz La'aretz, you'd also have Arabs living in Israel. But the Arabs living in Israel would probably be living better than the other Arabs living in Syria or someplace like that. And that will make them feel good about but this is all dreamland, you understand? By the way, who is that? That's Golda Meir with who? Evita. Okay? I'm sure there's a song that goes along with this. Don't cry for Golda. But meanwhile, until this happens, right? And Golda Meir says the same thing. That's the reason I have a picture. You know, the Arabs right now, temporarily, it's bad because they have a security problem, and there's a war on. It's not our fault. The Arabs want to drive us into the sea. We have no choice but to take preventative measures. But that's not our goal. Our goal is not to have a country that forever is a Jim Crow. Our goal is the opposite, that once there's a peace, then we won't have to have these measures. But meanwhile, there's no peace, just permanent war. So what am I supposed to do? That is the attitude of the Ben-Gurion establishment of the Israeli government, the Mapai party, all the rest of it. So Ben-Gurion and the Gourmet Bitachon, from day one, set up what they call Mimshal Tzva'i, a military government based on the British emergency regulations. The British, in fighting the Jews and others, when they dealt with the Arab uprising in the 1930s, passed laws, because the British ruled Palestine dictatorially. They had the right to do so. There was the government, the High Commissioner, and they weren't the Nazis, but if they wished to, and if there's an uprising, as there was in the Intifada, so they said like this, you have to fight counterterrorism. And so that means we have to be armed with the necessary laws. They do not have a constitution like you have in the United States. We get around ours also, but they didn't have a constitution. So therefore they passed what they call the emergency regulations, which are legal laws. And what they basically said is, like Abraham Lincoln did in the state of Maryland during the Civil War, which is, if I don't like the way you look or talk, or if I suspect of anything, I can arrest you at the drop of a hat without a trial. And you don't have a lawyer, and there's no trial, and I can hold you until I feel like it. If I want to have a trial, I have a trial. I can do like Bush wanted to do with the military. In other words, it's totally up to them. I repeat, that happened in the United States of America. Fort McHenry, once upon a time, perhaps you will recall, was a concentration camp for Union political prisoners, correct? So this is not unknown, and the reason I did is because of an emergency situation. So already in 48 and 49, Ben-Gurion and his guys set up a military government whose legal basis was the British emergency regulations. These laws are still in the books in 2015. Okay, I just want you to know that from the legal point of view. The state of Israel does have the right, I'm talking about legally, the state of Israel does have the right, if they see you at the airport, to pick you up, put you in a thing, and never be heard of again. Right? In other words, you can't, you can't go to the court and say, where's my writ of habeas corpus or something like that. If they wish to, they could pull this. Now, they don't, usually, but they do when they need to. If they used it a lot, it would have been thrown out already. But as a tool, the United States would like to have, Obama would like to have this as a card, you understand, when necessary. If this existed in America, then there wouldn't be no Guantanamo business. You could just round these guys up and hold them, claiming that the Al-Qaeda is out to wipe out America with nuclear weapons and things like this. So it's a special case. I know we don't have that in the United States, and I get it. We have a different tradition. But Israel just picked up the British tradition. So what I mean to say is the following. When Israel became a state on May 14th, 1948, they wrote the Declaration of Independence and they signed it and they sang Hatikva. And then after that, Ben-Gurion, but just before they left, he said like this: we want to declare all the existing laws, we the new government of Israel, want to declare all the existing laws in the books as still there, and all the laws apply except the white paper. Get it? That's what they said. And then he said, adjourn, everybody go home. So the white paper, of course, wouldn't allow Jews into the country. So he said, besides that, but everything else is still in the books. And they've never found it in their interest to withdraw the emergency regulations, as they called it, on the books. Now, from the purely legal point of view, the Israeli army possesses the power to control all movement throughout the country. That may be true in the case of the United States under emergency conditions, martial law, as they call it. I'm not a legal expert. I've heard this way and I've heard that way. But in Israel, they don't need any martial law. If they wish to, and again, they use this sparingly. But if you want to know what's on the books, he says, the Israeli government possesses the power to control all movement through the country. They possess the legal power to ground anybody without a trial. Now, what that I mean is like this. They can ground you so I guess you can't leave your house. You can't leave your city. You can only be in Green Spring. They can issue such laws, such orders, and they do count. You understand? So they have the right to arrest you, and Kal V'chomer, they have the right to ground you. I just want you to know what the legal situation is in the state of Israel. Now, Lamaisa, Israel has only exercised this power over Arabs. Get it? This is how Ben-Gurion got away with it. Once in a blue moon, really, once in a great while, you'll find that they'll do this with an Israeli Jew because of some security measure. This, perhaps you remember, I don't even know the whole story myself, some Australian Jew was totally grounded, and he died a couple months ago, isn't that right? With the Mossad or something like that. Nobody knows exactly what happened. And they did that to the third man in the Lavon affair back in the 50s. Rarely, but ordinarily, it's kind of understood as the rules of society that they're generally not going to do that. By that I mean, if you get into trouble in Israel, usually they'll go the regular route, and what they'll do is you get an arrest warrant, and a writ of habeas corpus, and you get a trial date and a lawyer and all that junk, right? That's ordinarily, I would say, 99% of the time. I'm talking about if you're Jewish. And even if you're Arab, usually. But if you get involved in something political, and by that I mean, when I say political, I'm talking about today. I don't mean you're protesting, right? And I don't mean that you're writing pamphlets and things of this nature. But I mean if you get involved in a bomb, okay? If you get involved in a kidnapping situation, and I don't know if you follow this, but I know this audience does, every week or two you see the Shin Bet just uncovered a whole group that was about to do this or about to do that, right? I remember there was recently was in, I think, East Jerusalem or something like that. They uncovered a whole group that was going to do this. Well, they don't have to have a trial and they don't have to have anything. They just round them up, you see? So they have these powers and rights. And Ben-Gurion kept it in there. Now, they don't listen closely. So you have 150, 200,000 Arabs in those years. They didn't, or maybe they couldn't, just beat up people and shoot them. Get it? I mean, nothing in the law that I just mentioned to you gives them the right to beat up anybody, correct? I talked about grounding. I talked about arresting. I want to be very clear, Berachal bitcha ketana, as they say. The laws that the British had the law didn't say you can do whatever you want to their body. But it did say, I'm talking about in terms of arresting, of imprisoning, of grounding, and things of this nature. The British regulations don't allow that. Now, by the way, the British did do that. And that's going to happen when you have a regime like that. But I want to be clear, the British didn't do it for fun. If they thought some Arab during the Intifada of 1936 to 1939 was in possession of information that will lead to a terrorism thing, they would beat him up to get the information. Like we have today in America, the question about waterboarding and things of that nature. But ordinarily, the laws didn't allow for this. So the authorities in Israel, since they're looking at not at a temporary measure, but a long-term, possibly permanent measure, the authorities in Israel had to come up with some kind of effective carrot and stick, what we would call today, the nice words are, a behavior modification program. Right? So how do they do that? How do you have a behavior modification program for 200,000 people? So they did this by controlling physical movement and by controlling access to education, employment, economic opportunities, other areas. So this is the trick, how Ben Gurion ran the show. If you're an Arab and you live in this area, you're grounded. You can't leave your town. And if you want to, you got to get special permission, period. Now, that's one. Number two, if you want your kid to get into a good high school, certainly post-high school, college, you got to get permission. If you want to get a decent job, the government controls all the jobs. This is the Mapai. You're going to have to get permission. You want to get access to good health care or something like that, right? Not the local clinic in your town, but you want to go to Hadassah Hospital, you're going to have to get permission. So this is what they call the carrot and stick method. Now, the purpose behind this is behavior modification. What do I mean by that? The purpose behind it is not to be sadistic. The purpose behind it is, so this person is not going to go and make trouble for Israel. Because if they do, then you won't get a permission to leave your town. If you do, you or your relatives, they won't give you permission to go to a hospital. If you do, you and your relatives won't get a good permission to get into college. So it's a carrot and stick. Get what I'm saying? So if you do that, you don't actually ever have to hit somebody. You follow? You don't actually have to get violent, but instead, you're able to do it this way. They also exercise control. Now, it's messy and it's bad. Everything I'm saying is not nice. I'm talking about what happened, okay? And really, they evolved this pretty quickly because they didn't want a situation where they actually go beat up people or kill them, right? They didn't. But on the other hand, you got to come up with some system where after all the smiles are over, again, how do you prevent people from doing this or get them to do that? They also exercise control by developing and properly exploiting networks of informants and collaborators. That's what they've done since the time of Adam and Eve. Okay? Meaning, if you say something against Ben Gurion, against the government, or you make some action, and Kal v'chomer, if you actually get involved in some kind of terrorist thing, somebody will tell on you. And then you will and it will be found out, and you will get no access to any of the things I just mentioned. You won't get a job. They'll never appoint you as a muhtar, as a mayor of the village or something of this nature. You won't get a decent situation. Your kids won't get a job. You understand? And the person knows this, and, in a small town, everybody tells on everybody. You know how it goes. So Lashon Hara here is used as a tool of administration and social control. Now, everybody in the world does this. By that I mean, in the city of Baltimore, Maryland, if the police know what they're doing, they will develop sets of informants downtown to know who's doing the drugs and who's planning to kill somebody. I mean, I hope they are, don't you? And if there's somebody planning to go and put a bomb somewhere, you hope the local cops will know, right, from their people in the street, who to talk to. At least that's what they do in the novels. No, but seriously, correct? That is basic policing 101. You got to know what's going on in your neighborhood for the purpose of finding out and preventing something bad from happening. It means awarding special privileges to informants and collaborators based on the oldest rules of politics, which of course go back to these guys, to Plato, Machiavelli, and people like that, who talk about politics with a capital P in the philosophical sense, right? These issues, because politics is about nonviolent conflict resolution, which means you have to know how to manage people, especially large masses of people, and how do you have something where you get people to do something? That's called politics. I'll repeat it again. How do you get people to do something? Right? That's called politics. If you have to put a gun to their head, literally, it's an absence of politics. Correct? That's an absence of politics. A normal society has some system of politics. When politics breaks down, you have Somalia, you have Syria, you have Iraq, you have these what you call failed states. You understand? Where the only thing that works is direct violence. Nothing else works. But when you have a system that works one way or the other, now it could be a dictatorship, it could be democracy, it could be this, it could be that. But when you have a system where nobody's actually putting a gun to somebody's head, nobody's actually shooting all the time, you have politics. Politics is the art of getting people to do things. A classic way of doing politics, especially administration, is using Lashon Hara. It just is. You understand? It is what it is. So we're talking about using Lashon Hara as a basis of awarding housing, jobs, education, mobility, as I said before. And so this lady better watch what she says, because if things get out of hand, the authorities will find out, and she won't get that job that she wants for her daughter or daughter-in-law or for herself. You follow? Because they don't have to give it to you. She won't get a chance to go and visit her aunt in a town 30 miles away. But if she doesn't do that, and she has a clean record, then if they know what they're doing, they'll give her. Yes, this is how it works. Already before 1948, basically after the riots of Hebron, where they killed all the Shiva guys, in 1929, this was a wake-up call for the nascent Yishuv. Ben Gurion, these guys were young, and this is where they learned the Arabs are going to play hardball. And the 1929 riots caught everybody by surprise. And the Yishuv said like this: we don't want to be caught by surprise in the future. And that's they set up the intelligence system, the spy system. Okay? Till then, they didn't have one. And starting 1929, there's a history to this. Starting 1929 and little by little in the 30s, what they did was they little by little built up a snitch system in which they, I'll tell you exactly what they did. The first thing to do was they compiled a list of each and every Palestinian town in the country. Who are they dealing with? Then they piled a list. This is how you do it. Then you compile a list, who's the mayor or the mukhtar in every town. Then you compile a list, who are the other big shots in every town, because the Arabs have clans and special groups, I'm talking elite groups. And then then eventually they move to the following level. You compile a list, who hates who in every town. Well, it's smart politics. Agreed? This is the dirty business of intelligence. You follow? This is what they do. I got news for you. Russia, for example, or China, has a list of who's who in Baltimore. Don't fool yourself. And who's the ins and who's the outs and who likes who and who doesn't. Don't fool yourself for a minute. Matter of fact, it wouldn't surprise me. The Arabs have lists like this of what's in Baltimore or whatever, to whatever level that they're interested in. Certainly Washington, you get it? This is what you call politics. So they call it the Shai, Sherut Yediyah or something like that. But they had, this is the Yishuv, they had this intelligence or spy system. And at that time, at a certain point in the 30s, they developed, the Israelis, before there was Israel, a network of informants throughout Palestine as part of an organized intelligence gathering project, which proved to be one of the most important assets of the Yishuv. So here's Ezra Danin, in older years. He's Israeli. He was born, I don't know where, in one of these little towns. He grew up with Arabs. Therefore, he spoke Arabic. And they put him in the 1930 or something like that in charge. Just do what I just told you. Go from town to town and hook up with these different Arab guys over there. Find out who's bribable, who's friendlyable, who's this and who's that. I'll give you one example. The Grand Mufti was the big enemy of the Jews. So find out who doesn't like the Grand Mufti. Because after all, he's from the Husseini family, right? And the Husseinis are, believe it or not, are always pushing the interests, financial and otherwise, of the Husseinis. So find out who doesn't like that, like the Nashashibi family or some other family, you get it? And then say, and talk to them. This goes back to Machiavelli. This goes back to Plato, as I said before. And so there you have it. There were many Arabs, for example, in the 30s and 40s who were anti-Grand Mufti for their own reasons, and therefore they cooperated with the Jews in one way or another, all during the 1930s and 1940s. On the other hand, let's put it this way. So when Israel takes over these territories in 1948 and 49, they already have a built-in network of informants of the guys who have been cooperating them until now. You get what I'm saying? I'll give you an example. Nazareth, for example, right, which Arab town. They had the Haganah had guys, a few in Nazareth, who they were teamed up with beforehand, who cooperated with the Israelis. Sometimes, one way or another. And then in addition to that, many Arabs who have been on the Mufti's team are now scared because they reside in Israel and the new borders. And so they rush to kiss up to the Shin Bet. So basically, I'm trying to give you an image in which, in 1948, 49, the Israeli army comes into this place, right? Kfar Qasim, Nazareth, Baka, you name the town. And as soon as they do that, immediately and they put up the Israeli flag, and all the Arabs come and they swear allegiance to the new country. That's what they do. And immediately, the Israelis will go and set up a headquarters, like in a police building or something like that. That becomes the headquarters of the Israeli authorities. And immediately, that day or the next day, a whole stream of people come and say like this. One group, Team A, will say as follows. He says, you know me, I've been dealing with you until now. So give me all the privileges, correct? You stick with me, I'll tell you who's who in this town. But in return, maybe get me a car. In return, my kid would like to get into a good high school. In return, if it's 49, they say like this: I have a cousin who ran away, but since he's a good friend of mine, maybe let him back in. You understand? Now, that's team A. Team B goes like this. We were until now, like Hushai Arki said to Absalom, until now I was on the other team, but I see you guys are in touch. Boy, do I have a lot of Lashon Hara to tell you. You understand? So if you make a deal with here, and if the Israeli guy is smart, he'll say, I'll take from this, right? As a matter of fact, what usually we'll say is, this is the world of informant. This guy comes and says he's on your side. I really know that even though he says on your side, he killed 2 Jews last year, and really he has a secret radio where he's cooperating with the Jordanian authorities. And, this is called intelligence gathering, detective work. And the Israelis guys say, I learned from this, I learned from that. And then, of course, others take in the informants. So you end up with a situation in which the newly formed Israeli internal security system, their FBI, the Shin Bet, the Sheirut Bitakon, which is under Issa Harel for many years, and he runs it very efficiently, they take it all in. So every town, if you have this interest, the files, I'm sure in the Shin Bet are bulging, if they have been computerized, on all the Lashon Hara for 60-some years in Israel about this little village or that little town or something like that. So everybody's telling everybody everything, and the job of the police or the authorities is to sift through, what's real and what's not real, and that's how the world is in there. Now, it is a mass of Lashon Hara. In order to do this right, in order to manage all this Lashon Hara and intrigue, Israel says, I need an Ungar Shiite, I need a Hungarian Jew. You see? I need somebody from Marmarosh I mean it. I'm serious. He said, I need a guy from Marmarosh because they're very good with the Lashon Hara. So he gets one, AMOS MANOR, and he was their guy. He immigrated from, I promise you, he said he immigrated from Transylvania, and he said, I guess you will know how to use this material well. And he runs it for 30 years. Maybe more, maybe closer to 40 years. Okay? And they did a very effective job. So, listen, you want the right guy. If he needed a guy to fix the clock, he would have called a Yeki. So, the point of all this is to control without having to use violence. You hear what I said? The purpose of this, in a certain manner, is humane. It's to control without having to use actual violence. Here's Stalin. A famous thing about Stalin is the following. He was a sadist, among other things. He was many things. But one of the things, he was a sadistic. Now, I'm going to tell you what I mean. His guys, what they called the secret police, the NKVD, the KGB, before that the Agpu and all this, the Cheka, he says, they were professionals. And so they would arrest somebody, and they would get all the information out of them they want, without resorting to physical violence. You get it? If you're a good interrogator, and you know your business, you know how to, they're experts in this sort of manipulation, and then get the information they want out of you. I'll give you an example. Suppose they caught a German spy. You don't have to beat him up. If you do the interrogation the right way, you will get all the information you want. Stalin said this, no, I insist you beat them up, tear their eyes out, bang their heads in, use rubber trenchants, use the battering rams and things like this. And they said, it'll actually hurt the process. And Stalin said, no, I want to do it. So in other words, he did it because he actually liked, he was a sadist. He liked imposing physical pain on people. That's how he got his kicks. And Berry also was put in the head of the KGB because he actually liked to do that stuff. A real, genuine professional will tell you don't do it. This is the debate, the machlokas you're having right now with Guantanamo, isn't it? Some say you need the waterboarding and all that kind of stuff. And there are others that say if you really know what you're doing, a genuine professional, you'll be able to get it without ever having to resort to force and violence. Now, I don't know enough, none of us here are security experts, unless I have in my crowd some torture expert or whatever. Hi. He said, however,
I'm undercover.
That's right. He says, however, you understand what I'm saying. Israel did not want to go to torture route. Get it? They don't want to go to torture route. How can you torture a whole population? You get it? But on the other hand, if you do these other things, you don't have to. Now, as I told you before, Ben Gurion really means the Israeli security apparatus, which is 3 separate groups. It's the army, Tzahal, it's the Mishtaras, the police, and Israel has, unlike the United States, a central national police system. You get what I'm saying? The entire police of Israel are under control of one officer. Now, in America, we have a different tradition. We have local. So there's the Baltimore police, which is totally separate from the Maryland police, and we don't even have such a thing as the United States police. What you have is a Federal Bureau of Investigation, you see? But you don't have a national police. That's one tradition. The French and other groups in Europe have a tradition in which there's one system of police, and Israel picked it up, And therefore, the national police control the whole country, and they have the files. And of course, then there's the Shin Bet, the Sherut B'Chon Kalali, which is separate from the police, and that's the internal security. And all three of these guys are operating. Sometimes they coordinate during these years, sometimes they do not. There's a famous story of SHMUEL. In other words, let's say A, B, and C. The Tzahal, the Mishtara, and the other one, and the Shin Bet. Sometimes these guys will hire an informer, sometimes that will, and sometimes A, in the early years, A won't tell B, and so B will pick a guy as an Arab that they're using, and A says, how can you use him? He killed one of our guys. But B says, no, we establish him, we trust him, and then he'll kill somebody, and then maybe somebody from C will kill the informant. It was a whole big mess. By the early 50s, it took them 4 or 5 years until they coordinated and worked it out. Do you get it? The early years were characterized along these lines. Now you have another problem from the Ben-Gurion point of view. It's a democracy. The Arabs can vote. They'll vote against the system, won't they? I mean, naturally, won't they? So in those, they'll bring it up in parliament and all the rest of it. How can a democratic country have a situation like that? Well, for starters, they're a small minority. 200,000 isn't enough to have a vote, right? Out of a population of 200,000 men, women, and children, it's not enough to have a vote, to have significant numbers. They can't outvote the Mapai. So that's not going to happen. But if they form small parties and get politically active and aware, they can protest to the whole world. There wasn't CNN at that time, but there was media. They can demonize Israel as an oppressor. And a political party may demand autonomy or joining Jordan or Egypt. A political party is a potent thing, as Zionism itself had demonstrated. True? So if there's an Arab party, it could be bad news. So Ben-Gurion, in the years I'm talking about, it's like this. We'll make our own Arab party. Right? We'll make our own Arab party. Here is, look at this list, if you will. This is the first Knesset. This is how the numbers worked out. Remember, you need 61 out of 120 to make a government, correct? So Ben-Gurion got 46. It's well below 15 seats less than he needs. You understand what I'm saying? This is I'm taking you into the dirty house of politics. He's got 46 seats. The Mapam, who he hated, had 19. Now the Mapam and Ben-Gurion weren't that far apart, but they were, narcissism was small differences. They hate each other. But 46 and 19, they could have run the whole country themselves. But that wasn't going to happen. Then you got the Frum, 46 and 16. Oh, there it is. That's what he does in the end. Okay? 46 and 16, that puts him over. Once he's got 62, so then some of the other parties he can join. But the basis of his power will be the Frum parties. Isn't that interesting? At 46 and 16. I'm not finished. The Cherut, forget it. Ben-Gurion would like to kill them. That's pagan. The general Zionists, they want a capitalist system, and Ben-Gurion wants a socialist economic system. That's not going to work. The Progressive Party, they're Yekis. He hooks up with them. That gives you 67. Agreed? Because, they're not bothering anybody. They're German Jews with the coffee clutch from Nahariya and from Tel Aviv. They're nice people. Pinchas Rosen, he puts them in charge of the Ministry of Justice, the Supreme Court. They're German Jew with all the virtues of the German Jews, and there ain't going to be no problem for Mapai. You get it? Okay, that's that. That's 67. The Sephardim, he teams up with them. They only have 4 seats because the Sephardim were just beginning to pour into Israel at that time. And it wasn't that large. What do you got left? The Communist Party, we're not going to have the Communist Party, Chas v'Chalila, right? Then we have something called the Democratic List of Nazis. What the heck is that? The answer is Ben-Gurion put 2 guys up, or he put a whole list up, and he told the Arabs, here's a group for you to vote for. Here's what I would propose. You get it? In other words, what I'm trying to tell you is like this. This is a front for the Mapai. Do you understand? So when you see that he has 46, actually he has 48. Do you get my point? Okay? These 2 guys, and they elect, there's Saif ad-Din al-Zuwebi and another guy. These were 2 Arabs on Ben-Gurion's payroll, as we would say today. They're doing, and I would say for the first 30 years of Israel, what I'm talking about does not exist today. For better or worse. Does not exist today. Today you have militant Arab parties. I know you know this. What's her name? Zuwebi's niece is now in there. She's trying to do tshuva. What's her name? Hanan Zuwebi or something. And, they're always attacking Israel and all this kind of stuff. But I'm talking about in 48, 49, 50s. It wasn't like that. I'm trying to show you. And the Mapai set up an Arab party which competed for votes. And therefore, what I'm trying to point out is like this. The politics of the 50s in Israel is if you're an Arab, you basically have two parties to vote for. What are the two parties? Well, one is this kind of party, maybe changes its name, and the other one is the communists, as you'll see in a minute. Those are the two ways you can vote, not for Jews, so to speak. You understand? And so this is how it goes. Now, the basis of this is reward your loyal friends. So everybody who will vote for this party does so, they hope that they'll get some kind of something out of the Ben-Gurion system. You understand? Reward your friends, get an apartment, whatever. You reward your friends, but don't create a party apparatus. Now listen closely to what I'm about to tell you. This party that I just showed you a minute ago, let's go back to that chart for a second. Right. This party, which they called Democratic List of Nazareth, and later they called it other names, Progress and Peace, all kind of names like that. It's not a party. By that I mean to say they don't have a central committee, and they don't have workers and the whole apparatus, because Ben-Gurion does not want that. When you have that, you have an Arab organization, who the heck knows where that'll end up? You get it? Today they're competing for votes, tomorrow they're making bombs. He didn't want that. What he says like this, when the election comes, we will give you so and so much money, we will get your name on a list, and just compete, right? If you, party workers, rallies, we will supply, the Mapai will supply you with the people. You get it? So the people actually show up and all are Jews, by and large. You understand? It's a certain Potemkin village, if you will. But it works. Right? It works because many Arabs say like this. First of all, if you're related to the guy, like Zuebi, he's a big clan, so you vote for your cousin. That happens even in Baltimore. But it's also true that, if you vote for the guy might say like this. When I get elected to Knesset, and your daughter needs a thing to get into a good school, you can call me and I'll use my connections with the Jews. You follow? And so that's what happens. So they get a certain number of votes. The real significance of these political parties lies in the complicated area of identity. As far as Ben-Gurion is concerned, the good part about this Arab party is it accepts the Israeli reality as well as the Israeli discourse that the Arabs living in Israel are Arabs and not Palestinians. In the era I'm talking about, in quote-unquote the good old days, from Ben-Gurion point of view, in the good old days, they didn't call themselves Palestinian. As you'll see in a minute, Jordan was occupying the West Bank and Egypt, the Gaza Strip. And so the notion of a separate group with a separate nationality wasn't out there. And he didn't want that developing among the Israeli Arabs. And so if you have these kind of parties, they are what I just called, they're Israeli Arabs. That's a certain thing, right? There's a certain new tribe called Israeli Arabs. And if everybody goes along with this, that'll be good for Israel. Remember, I'm talking about 49 and the 50s, before the PLO existed, when Palestinians live in Jordan, which has granted them citizenship. You hear what I said? In 48, 49, Jordan gave all the Palestinians who ran away there, including the whole West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and many other places, full Jordanian citizenship. There's no room for a Palestinian state. Where is it? It's the West Bank? No, Jordan says no, it's part of Jordan. You see? It's in Egypt. Egypt was always playing with the idea, but they never did it. Egypt never annexed the Gaza Strip. This is just interesting, right? Egypt had a guilty conscience, you understand? But it never really developed into anything real, and that's why they can get away with it. They control, in the years I'm talking about, they control the West Bank and Yerushalayim. Look at this. I'm going to show you a video of a year before the 67 war. King Hussein is visiting the Kotel. Visiting the Har Bayis, Take a look at this. It's a British film. It's no sound. There's King Hussein. He was young. This is the Har Bayis. You understand? Now, you know and I know the King David Hotel is not far away. It was a different country because Jerusalem was divided in two, as you will recall. That's his brother Hassan. Right? You all recognize these scenes? Okay? And you'll see over there, they're clapping and all. This is what you call rent a crowd, And that's how it works in the Middle East. And the fact of the matter, they're all, believe me, the Palestinians are not crazy over King Hussein. But nevertheless, you can't say it's under Jewish control. You see? Here's the Kotel. And it was empty. It was a narrow street. The Israelis blew up the houses opposite, so that's why you have a big plaza nowadays. At that time, the Kotel was just a little street in Jordan. You understand? Okay? And again, this is some British crew that worked over there. So it's Pasha an empty street. So what I'm trying to say is there's no specific Palestinian nationalism, other than that associated with the Mufti. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem was the personification, I mean literally the person, the personification of what we would call today Palestinian nationalism, and his image was badly tarnished in the 1950s because it is. Let's go to the next one. No, do you have the? I'm sorry. No, go back. I'm going to show you a thing. You know, he visited Hitler. In other words, you know, the Mufti was associated with the Nazis, so that was very bad for the Palestinians. So maybe there is a chance for an Arab-Israeli identity. Maybe there is. No, not really. Not when these guys are running the country. It's hard for an Arab to identify with this. You understand? It's hard for an Arab to identify with this. There wasn't a single Arab in the cabinet. There was hardly any Arabs. I don't think a single one in Ben-Gurion's time in any government position. You get what I'm saying? There was no Arab in the army. There's no Arab. I mean, there really was an exclusion. If the Arab parties do not really represent the aspirations, because they don't, the aspirations of the Arabs of Israel, because the average Arab of Israel doesn't want to just kiss up to Ben-Gurion, then who does represent them? The answer is the Communist Party. Okay? Look at this. This is a banner of the Communist Party in 1954, a Jew, an Arab, all together. You understand? And the idea is a binational state of some kind or other. Now, when I say a binational state, it wasn't two peoples. The Jews were like 1.5 million and so forth. The Arabs are 200,000. But that's what they mean. The communists assume the role of defender of the Arabs against the regime. They really do. And that's what the communists did in every country, except the countries they controlled. Then it was a different story. But in the countries they didn't control, I'll give an example. The communists were big champions of civil rights in America in the first half of the 20th century, if you know anything, right? Who was it that represented the Scottsboro Boys and things like this? Communist lawyers. You understand? In other words, this is what they do. This is Machiavelli. You go to some country and find out who's the have-nots, and then champion them. And all of a sudden you have a team. You follow? So in Israel, be the Arabs. But I want to say this. They really did represent and fight for the interests of the Arab Israelis under the Ben-Gurion system. So, for example, they encouraged Arabs who were internally exiled to leave their villages and return to their farms, which is an internal right of return. So here, listen to this closely. You know about the right of return. I'm talking about another right of return. I'm not talking about the Arabs who were kicked out and went to Jordan and Syria and Egypt and places like that. That's one group. Let's forget about them for a second. When 48-49 war was over, a bunch of Arabs were not in the towns where they lived. For example, they ran away from the fighting. Okay? Or maybe the Israeli army pushed them out because they want to take this town over and give them to Jews. And so here you have a situation in which there are Arabs living within the state of Israel, but because they're legally grounded, they can't move to take their actual home. So you can have, for example, an Arab who for one reason or another is in Nazareth, living in a basement, and actually they have a nice house in, Kfar Qasim or something like that, right? And they can't go there, or Yafo. And the reason they can't go there is the army won't let them out. You know what I'm saying? The army will not let them out. And so it's an internal exile. And how are you going to justify this on national security grounds? So the Communist Party made one of their big pushes during the 50s and 60s that they should defy what they call this illegal law. Now, it wasn't illegal, but it's unjust law, right? And I'll tell you, if you're an Arab, I'm trying to show you the other side of the coin tonight. If you're an Arab, you can totally understand this. There was one day a year in the Ben-Gurion time where there's a hafsakah, free, everybody can go wherever they want. You know what day it is? Yom Ha'atzmaut. No, I mean it. There's something in the Israeli culture. Yom Ha'atzmaut is a free day, you can go anywhere. All the Arabs would then go and visit their house. Get it? But then at nightfall, you got to go back. So it's tough, you see? So the Communist Party's in there. They advocate continually throughout the 50s and 60s for the abolition of the military administration. They say this is, I can't say this is communism, this is fascism, right? Or something like that. The Mimshal Tzva'i is the fascist side of Ben-Gurion. They fight for the civil rights of the Arabs, they do. Now Ben-Gurion is conflicted towards the communists. On the one hand, they're commies, right? They're behind this guy who's killing hundreds of millions that have gotten Israel, would kill everybody. On the other hand, he didn't want to delegitimate the Communist Party because the Communist Party accepts the legitimacy of Israel, though within the partition boundaries. The official position of the Israeli Communist Party and of the Soviet government, that's what I'm saying, is Israel has the right to exist, but only here. You get what I'm saying? The original partition plan. The Communist Party never said that they recognize the justice of the lands that Israel took in the 48-49 war. But on the other hand, if Israel will withdraw to this, then Israel has a legal right to exist. So that's a great power, granting legitimacy of some kind to Israel. Israel is such a bad shit, they'll take whatever they can get. So within the context of the Arab-Israeli conflict, in which the Arabs say that Israel has no right to anything, the communists are not that bad. Now, if you're an Arab communist, this is a difficult pill to swallow. You get what I'm saying? A real Arab communist like TOUBI, who was a big member of the Knesset for many, many years, and was always cursing at Ben-Gurion. He was a tough guy. He's a communist lawyer, and as a communist, it's like Catholic Church. The Pope is infallible. Stalin is infallible. So as a communist, you have to say like this: Israel has a right to exist, but in the other borders. So when he would go to Arab conferences in Arabia or Egypt, and they would say Israel has no right to exist, he had to say Israel has a right to exist, but in the other borders. They would say, they said, how can it come from an Arab mouth? Words that you just said. And it was very tough for him to do so. Now, I want to tell you something, and this is really cool. Those with a rabbinic Talmudic mind will appreciate this. In 1956, Khrushchev made his famous de-Stalinization speech, correct? You know what I'm talking about? Where he said Stalin made a lot of mistakes and Stalin was wrong, and he had a cult of personality and all the rest of it. So, in other words, for the first time, I want you to understand what I mean. The communists never, ever said they're ever wrong. Not from 1917 down to 1956. That's one of the appeals of communism, just as the Catholic Church was appeal also to certain types of people. Many Western intellectuals in the 20th century, skeptics and others, converted to Catholic. I don't know if you know that. I mean, it's quite an interesting record. They just were. Including Evans and Novak. Novak's a Jewish and he became a Catholic. It is what it is. And many people, as we know, particularly Jews, converted to the religion of communism. And I say the religion of communism because it's infallible. They have the right answer to everything. Lenin is never wrong. Stalin is never wrong. Period. And then in 1956, Khrushchev, as we all know, said Stalin was wrong on some things. Right? Now, what the Communist Party said he's wrong in is, it's mutter to say he's wrong. What the Communist Party said he's not wrong in, it's usher to say he's wrong. But that's what it is. Okay? I mentioned a couple weeks ago, real believers like Rabbi Cheskel Abramsky's son, Shimon Abramsky, was so shocked, for 2 more years, he continued to believe that Stalin was right. It took a while to internalize that into the system that could be wrong. But if you're TOUBI, you say like this: so if Stalin could be wrong, and Stalin poskined that Israel has a legitimate right to exist, so maybe it's okay if the Communist Party in Moscow will say, they can say one of the mistakes of Stalin was the recognition of the legitimacy of Israel. That will help us a lot with the Arabs. You understand? It makes sense, but Moscow declines. GROMYKO said, I'm the one who raised my hand to say Israel could exist. Israel is a bad regime and they should go back to the old borders, but Israel has the right to exist. In other words, no Arab tells us what we say Stalin was wrong, but whatever we say Stalin was not wrong, is not wrong, and it's usher to change. And TOUBI, as a believing communist, Ani Mamin, he had no choice but to say, all right, Now, I just want you to know, just a matter of interest, after the 1967 war, the Soviet Union changed its policy, and he said Israel can be legitimate within the 1967 borders. You get what I'm saying? They thought that this was a carrot and stick. They thought this was an inducement for Israel. People don't know this. So after 1967, the 70s and the 80s, the Soviet government under Brezhnev thought, what's wrong with the Jews? We're actually quite liberal. We now concede that they have the right to the Green Line. You understand? That's quite a concession on the part of Moscow. Why can't the Jews be equally forthgiving and evacuate the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and the Golan Heights? So, religion, ideology produces all kind of funny things. Now, Ben-Gurion was a staunch oh my God, he was like to the right of Truman, So he views the Communist Party as very dangerous. And he says, in his mind, if all the Arabs would be converted to communism, then they will in effect be a fifth column organized. The communists have experience, they're ceaseless, they work 24/7, I mean that. And they're very organized, and then they'll blow up the country, So what Ben-Gurion does is, he brings back Archbishop Hakim and the Muslim clergy to fight the communists in the Arab villages. You understand? Those Ben-Gurion brings back religious figures who were kicked out in 48 and 49, and he says, you guys can come back because we want you to spread Christianity because that'll fight communism. We want you to spread Islam, fight communism. This is a dangerous tool, my friends. It reminds us of the unfortunate fact that it was the state of Israel that created Hamas. Am I right or am I wrong? I'll say it again. It was the state of Israel back in the 80s. This was stupid, but they've done their stupid things too. They created what was now Hamas, and then it got out of hand. You see? So you better watch what you do when you do these things. But when you're running these administration kind of situations, there's like a tendency to play in there. Ben Gurion's number one guy, Josh Palmon, who was born in Israel among Arabs, been there since the 30s. He even brings back Arabs who killed Jews under the Mufti, but are now undertake to fight the communists. So in the Communist Party newspaper, right, they'll say, MIKUNIS was the Jewish head of the Communist Party. He said, this is not fair. We communists helped you get the Czech weapons. And when we were doing that, you guys were killing Jews. And you favor him? You get it? Shmuel MIKUNIS was Jewish. He was a communist, a real communist. But in 48, when Israel had no weapons, he was sent by Ben Gurion, you hear what I'm saying? To go to Prague and say, tell the communist government there to give us guns and weapons that we need. And he did. So it's funny. The communists played a role, people don't notice, in helping Israel survive in the 48 war. Matter of fact, he went with an Arab. It was Shmuel MIKUNIS and Emil Habibi, who was later a very strong Arab member of the Knesset, anti-Ben Gurion. And they say, you're bringing back guys who worked for the Mufti, because you really are fascists. You understand? So this gets very messy, and like the Looking Glass War and all that. All I can say is the Byzantine politics of the Levant, the Middle East. If nothing makes sense, then that's the first step, right? First say, I don't know what's going on, and then you pursue from there. And so you had these guys there for all these years. Now, these are the communist members of the Knesset, as you can see over here. You have a Yosef? He said, and he's Jewish, and he's Jewish, and he's Arab, and he's Arab. And these were constantly debated. And they're the only party that has both Jews and Arabs. You get it? And so that's part of their special appeal over there. The communists themselves, by the way, very interesting, are kind of split between those who are really pro-Arab and those who, in their crazy way, mean well. This guy really is pro-Arab, as I told you before. He was a communist, he signed on, and so he swallowed the party line, all the rest of it. But when he was caught off guard, he would say, in a few years, this lousy state will cease to exist. You understand? Like the way the Arab representatives in the Knesset do today. And this whole thing is rotten to the core and illegitimate. Israel has no right to exist, all the rest of it. This guy was Jewish. He was a communist, he was a Stalinist, and all that kind of stuff. But in the other way, in his way, he thinks he's helping Israel. Get what I'm saying? In his way, in his mind, he thinks he's actually doing something good for the Jewish people. Nowhere is this brought out more powerfully than in the most famous of the Israeli communists, which is Moshe Sneh. Let's go to the next one. Oh, wait, hold on. Then stop that for a second. Let's go back. Yeah. I didn't know they had that there. He says, yeah, right. There was a guy in Israel named Moshe Sneh. Sneh is a little bush, so therefore his name was Kleinbaum. Okay? And in Israel, you need a book, Who is Who, and a little knowledge of Yiddish. So he says, and Moshe Kleinbaum was a Polish Yid. And he grew up and went to college in Poland. And he became a big macher in the Zionist movement in Poland with Yitzhak Greenberg, in other words, with the regular bourgeois general Zionists. And he was a big deal over there in Poland. And like many Polish Jews, believe it or not, he was loyal to Poland, at the same time a staunch Zionist. Then comes the Second World War. This is a remarkable story. That's why I'm telling it to you. And then comes the Second World War. He's a Polish officer. I think he was a doctor, maybe a medical officer. He's a Polish officer. And Poland gets defeated. And so they all run east, and they get arrested by Stalin, right? Now, what did Stalin do with all the Polish soldiers, officers? He shot them in the back, ahead. Okay, I'm going to show you in a minute. Poland just made a movie about it. But it's very accurate. Most of the Poles, at one time or another, especially when they were first arrested, they had a chance to escape. But they said a Polish officer does not desert his comrades. Okay? So they all got a shot. Kleinbaum's given a year. They said, if I have a chance to escape, I'm going to escape. So he got out of there. He's one of the very few Polish officers not shot in the back of the head by Stalin. Take a look at this. I'm not going to show you the sound, but this here. They take each Polish soldier out, 40,000 of them. Put him back over here, tie him up. Azoi, and there we go. Bingo. Okay? Oh, it's very smart. You say bullets. See? The Russians invented that. Shoot him once in the back of the head and shine. So they found, in the middle of World War II, they found 40,000 bodies shot in the back of the head. Stalin said Hitler did it. Yeah, right? And to make it worse, Poland knows all about this. Russia denied it. And only a few years ago, Russia admitted it. And Poland sent a whole delegation. Do you remember this? Poland sent a whole delegation to Moscow to get the records. The plane crashed and they were all killed. Right? And Putin said like this, I have no idea. Right? And you know something? It might even be true. Nah, not really. So, again, it happened over and over again. So this guy was one of those who got out of this. So it's quite a story. So here's a guy who was a Polish officer, a big leader in the Zionist movement. He escapes to Palestine in 1940 because he ran to Vilna, and then from Vilna he got to Palestine. And he's a big Zionist macher, so they got a certificate for him. And he comes to Tel Aviv, and they make him Sar Bitachon. Do you understand what I'm saying? He was the guy in charge of the Haganah. He was a big shot. He was a big shot, and he ran the Haganah. He ran the Zionist military from 1940 to 1947 or something like that. Then Ben-Gurion took it over. So he was a central figure in the Zionist movement. In 1946, the British arrest all the Zionist leaders on a certain day called the Black Sabbath, and except the ones who ran away. And this guy runs away to Paris. And he's in the same hotel with, you won't believe this, he's in the same hotel with Ho Chi Minh, who's also running away from the French and, engaged in all kind of clandestine activities. And Ho Chi Minh said like this, you want to be Matzliach in the national liberation thing? Sign up with the communists. He said, that's what I did. Right? It's because they will help you, and they'll give you weapons and things like this. And it converted him. Didn't happen overnight, but that started it. Why do you waste your time on novels? Okay? And so, wait a minute. And so the following year after Israel becomes a state, and he had been a big shot in the Haganah and all the rest of it, he shocked the Israeli body politic by converting to communism. He became a member of the Communist Party and a big shot, and a member of the Knesset in the Communist Party. And he said like this, I'm doing this with Tovas Am Yisrael, and in his mind he meant it. You get it? Now, he was a big macher in communism for years and years and years, but he's a Jewish communist. He's not an Arab communist. You follow what I'm saying? In the Communist Party, when the Arab members say, let's do this to do Israel, if it's an Arab thing and not a Jewish thing, he'll be against it. You follow? So the Byzantine politics are unbelievable. When he dies, he leaves in his last will and testament, I'm going to be buried by the Chevra Kadisha in the Jewish way. So I forget which Rosh Hashiva thing is. Thomas Nafshi Mosi Sharm. You understand? He said, like Bill said, what's it? It was a shock. You understand? The communists couldn't get over it. I remember when I was younger, it was a total shock. Snell wants to be buried by a Chevra Kadisha, and he was. So all of which seems to be a little bit like the Jewish legend of St. Paul or something like this. He was sent in to infiltrate communist headquarters in favor of the Jews. Now, moreover, in addition to everything I'm saying, there's the very tricky question of land. Karka. What happens to all the lands of the Arabs who fled or who were kicked out? And there's a lot of that. And who gets it? Now, this is so complicated, I'm not even going to go into it now, because the Turks had ruled a lot of land, but the Turkish laws are very complicated. If you're an Aris, if you're a sharecropper, if you're this, does the government own it? Do you own it? Do you have a lease on it? And the Israeli government's like this, whatever the Turks had and the British had, we now have. In addition to that, Ben-Gurion wants to grab every piece of land that he can get his hands on, because to him, that's Zionism. Others will say, what do you need? You have plenty of land as it is. What do you have to take it? All during the Ben-Gurion period, there will be times when they'll take this from this Arab town or that Arab town, and that's going to take them all off. Israel passes all kind of legal circumlocution, the custodian law and this law, which amounts to one thing, lanu haaretz. If you're an Arab, this is infuriating. If you're a Jew, he just said, well, this is called securing the lands against it falling back in the wrong hands. The Arabs said, we're not the wrong hands, we're living here. And so the fight goes on. What happens, therefore, during the Ben-Gurion era? Planting a lot of trees. When you bought and I bought when we were kids on Tu B'Shvat, a lot of lands on Arab lands. You understand? Kibbutzim, towns. As I said before, there's an internal exile, there's external exile. This was part of the external exile with the ones that were kicked out of the country in 48. Internal exile, well, you're in the country, but you're not in the town you're living at. maybe the reason they won't let you go back to the town you're living at is that town doesn't exist. It was plowed over. You see? Now, Arabs write novels and stories about this. Jews don't generally read these novels. You understand? That's how it goes. They are translated into Hebrew, but they don't get much of a reading. Okay? Because because this is the Ben Gurion time, the Arabs, if they could, would kill all of us. So I don't have time to be pity for them. If this was here, they'd wipe out the Jews. That's how they feel. So then there's the thorny problem of religion. Now I'm going to deal with something very interesting tonight. In fact, you're going to be one of the very few people around anywhere that understands this. If I may be so bold, and I am. Well, I mean it. You'll see. What makes Ben Gurion make the state intimately involved with religion? That's a good question. As you know, today, hold on. He says, what makes the country? It's funny. The Mapai was an atheist party. It's a Marxist party. Ben Gurion was. They should be anti-religious. The general answer to this question is it was politics. It's 46 and 16. He had 46 seats. He needed 16, and therefore, in order to kiss up to the religious, he had to give them some, and he preferred to do that than team up with the communists and Mapai and the others. That's true, but it's called necessary but not sufficient explanation. That's not the real reason. But as you know and I know, it's kind of funny. Today, Israel is maybe the only Western country and one of the very few non-Muslim countries anywhere where there is not freedom of religion. Am I right or am I wrong? You can't get married reform. You don't even get recognized by the state. Now, if you're Orthodox, you don't have a problem with that. But if you're Reform, you have a problem with that. If a boy and a girl meet and want to get married, he's a Jew, she's a Christian. They can't get married in justice of the peace. Either he has to convert to her or she has to convert to him. Right? You understand? They have to resort to shtick, like you're saying, to fly somewhere else and then come back. So what I mean, that's a safety valve. But it's funny, in the year 2015, there's no freedom of religion in Israel. Why isn't it that Israel is like everywhere else? You do what you want, that the state doesn't interfere in the private exercise of religion. And yet it's not like that. If you want to get a get, I mean, you know all this sort of things. It's funny, but it's still there today. Why is it there? Why is it that Israel has, more than anything else, they're intimately involved with religion? These are the basics. There's a Reuven Kassadego, that's Avad Yosef when he was young. Here's Rabbi Yosef, who used to be on the Rabbanut court. That's the Rabbanut court. Rabbi Yosef, that's Avad Yosef next to him. And there's the Rabbi Nassim. You know, these are famous names. I'll say it again. The Rabbanut court. Rabbi Yosef used to be on the government court. So what is all this sort of thing? As a socialist, as an agnostic, what does Ben Gurion care about religion? Why doesn't he go do a separation of church and state? Right? He's Ben Gurion at a bris. Right? He's the kvater. Right? What are you doing that for? Okay? Shimon Peres, the son. He says, what's going on here? The answer is not really what you think. So my friends, listen and learn. The real problem, now I'm cutting away all the baloney, okay, and getting right to it. The problem is not Judaism, the problem is Islam, which is the faith of most of the Israeli Arabs. Islam has the potential to be a powder keg. We know this today, and they knew it at that time. The British, in their time, created their own monster when they created the office of Grand Mufti, which was well supplied with emoluments. Okay? This guy was an Arab. In 1920, Sir Herbert Samuel created, when they started Palestine under the British, an office like a pope. They said there'll be one official who will control all the mosques and appoint all the qadis and all the teachers in the yeshivas and things like that. And they gave him this job. So they created a monster, right? He was rich and influential thanks to his revenues and his power to appoint clergymen and religious judges, dayanim. And Hajj Amin Husseini used his power base to become a terrible thorn in the side of the British and the Jew. Right? He's going visiting Hitler. Okay, the famous scene. Correct? How did he do that? Where did he get the money? Where did he get the power? All the rest of it. You made him, baby. You understand? When the British came in, there's no such thing called the Muslim church. It's not the Catholic Church. There was the people living here, the people living there. The British, for their own ideas of organization, they also created chief rabbi, didn't they? Out of their own ideas of organization, they created artificially a certain system. Now, this turned out to be terrible. Ben Gurion was determined that the state of Israel will not have an office called Grand Mufti. Understand? It is necessary for the government to control religion, to prevent the religion from getting power. Okay? Israel should not have a dynamic troublemaker in a position to turn religion into a tool against the state. This is very ingenious. If the position doesn't exist, it can't happen. You understand? If there's no framework for all the Muslims to get together in a national council or something like this, it won't happen by that alone. In other words, you can stifle something through administrative measures, and that is exactly what the Israeli government was determined to do. So Islam is not established by the state, but rather the state prevents Islam from becoming organized at anything but the local level. Nobody in Israel, therefore, represents the Muslims of Israel, quote unquote. This is a very important point to understand. Now, this was something that only a very acute observer could notice, and nobody noticed. You understand? Seriously. Nobody knows this. There's a lady, Pellet, who wrote a book on this a couple of years ago, Elisa Pellet. But nobody knows this. By preventing administratively such things from happening as an ishtar. In order to do that, the government has to notice what's to stop the Muslims from getting together and electing a grand council? The military government. If the government says we're not going to allow people to get together for this, so it physically can't happen. You get what I'm saying? And if it physically can't happen, so then you don't have such a position. All during the Ben Gurion era, the government plays cat and mouse with the Muslims. They say we need trained clergymen in order to run our mosques. We need trained dayanim to run the religious courts. Mañana. That's what happened. Ben Gurion said, yeah, tomorrow. This is one time in his life he visited Arab village, 1959, when there was already pressure to disestablish military regime. Ben Gurion says, no, I like the Arabs, So this is what you call media event. You understand? Ordinarily, though, but what about, understand what I'm saying. There were no yeshivas, no madrasas, okay? They wouldn't allow it. There was no high schools, what shall I say, like a mechina or something like that. The government just didn't have it. There's public school. And if you want to have private religion classes afterwards, gives them to hate. But at your local level. And you say, but locally we don't have any Talmidei Chachamim. We'll fix that. Mañana. You understand? We need schools to teach the faith. Mañana. Okay? And so the Islamic religion is kept weak, deliberately weak, during the Ben Gurion era. The clergymen are losers, meaning the guys who become clergymen, right, thanks to the government intervention, are deliberately people who are second class. They're not very knowledgeable. They're complaining. They say you hired a janitor to be the local rabbi or a qadi. They're paid by the state, so they got to be loyal to the state, more or less. The high schools and yeshivas to train the young and idealistic, none of that. And so there are zero young and idealistic Muslim clergy and scholars. You know what I'm saying? In the 50s and 60s, all the clergymen are like 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and that sort of thing. You know guys in the 20s and 30s? Because that is another good, going to revive the mufti. Thank you, no. You hear this. A messier problem is the waqf properties. You understand, I know you read the paper, the waqf is a Muslim tzedakah, like a hegdish. So aggregately, it's a giant source of wealth. All over the country, if you take what the Arabs, waqfs over centuries have put together, this person dedicated this land to be a religious source of income, and this house, and that thing, and this thing over there, and every mosque, of course, is a huge source of wealth. Whoever controls it got a lot of money. If a single Muslim entity at the national level owns it, it'll be powerful, and it can use the power and the money to create political parties and power. Okay, so it's not going to happen. So Ben Gurion government will be resorting to all kinds of stratagems to make sure that no single such entity exists. You understand? Who controls the waqfs? It's never clear during the Ben Gurion era. The government kind of controls it. The Arabs sort of control it. The Arabs don't control it. The government does control it. They don't control it. You understand? It was all kept up in there. And there's always bothering the Arabs at the local level. But Ben Gurion was not going to say, I'm not going to give these guys $1 billion. It's not going to happen. You understand? Then there's the fact that some of the lands that Ben Gurion wants for Jewish settlement, suppose it's built on the site of an Arab village owned by the waqf, which you could have such a thing. What do you do then? What if some Arab says, as they do now, I declare half of Jerusalem or something like to be a waqf. By the way, I don't know if you know this, some of you know this, Rechavia, the Knesset, all that's his own land owned by Gentiles. It's by the Greek Orthodox Church. Do you know that? So I'm just saying, this is the facts on the ground in Israel. So it's very messy. It's not black and white. It's a tough situation. Now you know what, notice, let's put it this way. So once it's clear that there was no way that Ben Gurion could just let the Muslim religion just grow any way it wants, you'll see why he was the last person in the world interested in separation of church and state. You get it? But if that's true, then he has to apply this policy of state control and state subsidy, not on one religion, because that would be a war of Israel against Islam. Has to be, no, this is how we treat all religions, right? And he doesn't want to do that. So now you know why it is that Ben-Gurion wanted to also control and state subsidize the Jewish religion. So it's ironic, out of this nutty system that I just described, the big beneficiaries is the Mizrahi and the Aguda, so to speak. You understand? I mean, who's the benefit of all this, what I just pointed over here? Look at the next picture. No, I go back. He didn't have it over. I had the Ponevezher row. No, I'm serious. The yeshivas and things like this will benefit from the fact that Israel does not have, and does deliberately not want to have, a separation of church and state. Now today, right? Let's leave this picture here for a minute. Today, this kind of out of date, correct? The Arabs have, everything I just described you radically changed after 1967, because once they conquered the West Bank and all that, they were then hooked up contiguously with a giant Arab population, which had yeshivas and trained clergymen and all the Islamic stuff you want. Although Israel still today prevents a grand mufti, but you already have, as you know, very large Arab leadership over there. But in the realm of politics, religion, land, and mobility, the Arabs are emasculated. To Ben-Gurion, an Arab is an Arab. Now, his experts know better, okay? And the experts will tell you, no, don't do this. The Arab Christians, therefore, are treated, I'm sorry, I went out of order. I beg your pardon. This is why Ben-Gurion subsidized all these schools. Yeah, let's go back one. Yeah, he put it out of order. Actually, there's a famous joke that, you know, they say, the Ponevezher was asked, do you say Hallel on Yom HaAtzmaut? And he said, I do what Ben-Gurion does. Not really. This is Ben-Gurion with a black hat, right? Saying Hallel on Yom HaAtzmaut in 1950. But it's a good story anyway. Which goes to show you, he knew how to dance at a religious thing when he wanted to. What you have to understand is when he does this, he really has in mind, we have to establish the Jewish religion so we can establish the Islamic religion so we can control them to prevent a grand mufti from emerging. Isn't this a wonderful twist of Middle Eastern politics? But as I say, let's move to the next picture and then the one after that. Yeah, okay. Here you have a guy, Archbishop Hakim, who was the head of the Greek Orthodox. Actually, it's not the right term. I said it wrong. It's Greek Catholics. They're a branch of the Catholic Church. They're not Greek Orthodox, but they have their own Masorah within the Catholic Church called the Melkites. And they've been there for 1,000 years. And I'll have him in a movie later on. He was kicked out in 48. But in 50, Ben-Gurion brings him back, right? First of all, to fight against the communists. And second of all, is divide and conquer. His interest is to treat the Arabs better than the Christian better than Muslims. So then the Muslim and the Christian won't like each other, and they won't cooperate against Israel. You see? And welcome to the Middle East, my friends. No, I'm serious. The Druze are somewhat roughly integrated into the state in the 1950s. In 53, they're drafted into reserves. In 57, the Druze are drafted into regular army, even though there's a big opposition of many Druze. So we like to think today of this, right? And it's true. Today, especially, a long time has passed, Druze are a basic part of the Israeli army, and Israel has been interested since the 50s, cynically, to say like this: Druze are not Arabs. Don't regard yourself as Arabs. It's a different religion. They said, well, if you go by the language, it's the same thing. We don't go by the language, we go by the religion, right? And Israel will give, if you want to set up a Druze yeshiva for Druze religion, you get $1 zillion, no problem. You get it? Because it's in Israel's interest that they should not identify with the Palestinians and things of this nature. This is hardball politics. Now, to be very accurate about this, the British, for their own reasons, tried to bunch all the Arabs together. In the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, the British, as part of their particular policy, tried to create, you heard what I'm saying? Create an Arab mass. Ben-Gurion's interested in undoing that. He said, the British had no business doing that. The Jews and the Arabs are separate things. And the Christians and Muslims are separate things. So we want to go back to miutim, minorities. Israel has a lot of different minorities. Many of the Druze leaders were opposed to the draft. On the other hand, certain Druze leaders were in favor of it. The army forced, I'll say it again, forced, starting in 1957, Druze 18 years old, to join the Tzahal. For a couple of years, it was tough. They would run away, and they would hide and do draft dodging in various ways until finally the state, exercised enough control over it through the carrot and stick system that they just got used to it. And now it's taken for granted that all the young people join the army, but you don't know what the Jews are really thinking. You understand? You don't know. It was a moderate success. And then there are lots of little groups out there. If you can identify them as separate, that'll be good for Ben Gurion. For example, you have the Circassians. This is in Israel. Do you notice? There's 2 villages. There's about 4,000 of them. They're their own group. They're Russian, who were forcibly converted to Islam way back when. They have Russian characteristics. They speak Russian language. The Turks brought them in when the Tsars kicked them out. They've been in Palestine since the 18-something. And they've always been friendly with the Jews because the original Jewish Zionist pioneers spoke Russian too. You understand? And they fought for Israel in 48, and ever since. I'm just telling you. And so if you're Israel, you say this, why should I bunch them together with the other? Why give Arafat an extra piece? Why do that? That's how they look at it, right? And so any group that you configure like that is there. Moshe Sharet, as I told you, said really there are many disparate groups. It was the British who administratively lumped them together as Arabs. Really, they're just a minority, it's a miyutim. In 57 to 61, the years we're focusing on, the aftermath of the Sinai campaign, Nasser recouped his military defeat by ramping up the rhetoric. So Radio Cairo is so fiery as the denunciations of Israel that many Arabs feel war's coming soon. So if you're in 57, 58, 59, 60, now you and I know it didn't happen, but I'm telling you, they hear every night on the radio, and they thought, oh boy, Nasser's going to invade any minute. Excitement reaches frenzy proportions in the Arab sector when Nasser forms the United Arab Republic together with Syria. So it looked like a prelude to a war. It's Egypt here, it's Syria there, and I'm talking about if you're an Arab, no, not a Jew. If you're a Jew, you're quaking. If you're Arab, you say, yes, 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 go, go, go. All right? It was really tough. Now, it's funny. Perspective is everything. The past is always changing. The way we would look at it today is that this was actually good because it retarded Palestinian national development by about 70 years. You get it? The local Arabs and the others, they said, we don't have to do nothing. Nasser's going to fight for us and conquer the country for us. So they never got off their duffs, which was good for Israel. But who could figure that out, in retrospect, as they say before? It's also true, by the way, Nasser killed about 500,000 of the Muslim brothers. Who should figure this out? We've reached a sad state, my friends, when in 2015 we said, oh, bring back Nasser, right? But life is strange over here. The Israeli Arabs listen to the radio. They're convinced liberation and death to the Jews is at hand. They react accordingly. Oh boy, that's all Ben Gurion needs to hear from the snitches. This guy's listening to the radio. That guy says, in 2 weeks we'll shech this kibbutz, and so forth. Oh my goodness. There is great tension in the Arab areas during these years. And that's what's going on in 57, 61. At the same time, a section of public opinion is turning away from the military government. Israel, with all of its faults, is a democracy. And a democracy, at the end of the day, does not feel comfortable with many of the things I've been talking about. You understand? And it can introduce measures that it's an emergency, and you can say the 50s was still an emergency, and yet the public doesn't feel comfortable with it. Many parties, including Menachem Begin, believe it or not, begin to feel uncomfortable with a democracy, which is maintaining a military government. Right? When all said and done, the contradiction between the expressed, democratic ideals and what's going on. Even Yigal Allon, who was Israel's top commander in 48, and the guy who kicked most of the Arabs out. Even it says there are other ways to maintain intelligent but less obtrusive control. Right? This is going too far to ground people, treat them like babies. It's going too far what you're doing over here, right? There are ways to make sure the Arabs won't kill us without going through all this kind of stuff. On the other hand, you have the Ben Gurion guys. Issa Harel, the head of the Shin Bet, says, you want Algeria? At this time, there's a war raging in Algeria. And the Muslims there are putting bombs and shechting people, literally slaughtering people all the time and all the rest of it. You could easily have that over here. And the only reason it's not is because we're sitting on it and we're preventing it from happening through administrative measures. So you can say what you want, but if you do what you starry-eyed liberals want to do, you'll turn Israel into a nightmare. That's what he said at that time. And listen, there are two sides to this. After all, a couple weeks ago, they went into Har Nof and shecht a bunch of people just out of nowhere. It's tricky. These things are not easy. Ben Gurion said like this, if they get rid of the military government, I resign. Ani mitpater. So he was very strong on this. There's a close vote in the Knesset. Okay? Most of the parties voted against it, and Ben Gurion won by one vote. He won by one vote by bribing the Agudah. You understand? He said, I'll give you extra money for a school, and you vote for this. And I go to say, hey, the Arab military, who cares? You know? And so with their 4 seats, you understand, he put them over. Then he went one by one. This Rebbe, Ishmael Levin, was, I think, the brother-in-law of the Ger Rebbe. He was the head of their good in the Knesset. And him and Ben Gurion were very good personal friends, even though when it comes to religion, they didn't exactly see eye to eye. But on a one-to-one basis, he made it his business to buddy up to him. And life is strange in the Middle East. By the way, I want you to know, the 2 Arabs on the Arab party of Ben Gurion's party voted for, they were also part of that one vote majority. You understand what I'm saying? The 2 Arabs that are there, they were there also. I think, did I skip this? Yeah. Go back, I'm going to show you something. Go back a few slides. Go in. Yeah, stop right there. Yeah. These 2 guys, this guy was one of the 2 guys that voted for. I'm going to show you the crazy politics in Israel. This guy's Jabra Moadi. He was a member for many years, decades, on one of these Ben Gurion type Arab parties. And he's a sheikh of the Druze. So he's the Druze representative there. And as a Druze representative, he represents the community. He got them all kind of, he worked on their behalf, like a Baltimore politician. Okay? A good one. Now, listen, he fixes the ticket and it stays fixed, Now, hold on for a second. He was there for many, many years. Eventually, the political thing changed, and he had to team up in a party with this guy, Hamid Abu Rabia. He's a Bedouin. Now, you might say like this, they both look alike. Well, they're not really. One's a Druze, one's a Bedouin. And the party didn't, this in the 80s, and the party didn't win enough. They only won like 2 seats or something like that, and there were like 3 guys, so they make a rotation. You get it? So you get in there, but you agree after a year to give up your seat. So he agrees after a year to give it the seat, and then he can take it. But guess what? When a year's up, he said, I don't want to leave. Like we had with Jack Pollock not long ago, yeah? He said, I don't want to leave. Right? So his son killed him, right? In the Hilton in Jerusalem, in the lobby. Right? That's how politics is run in that part of the world. I'm just trying to show you what's going on over here. So, but he was the one vote. Him and Dagoda was the one vote to put it over. So the military government remains. And I conclude the world doesn't notice all this. Everything I'm talking to you, Israel was able to keep out of the world view. Isn't that interesting? There was no CNN. If anything, this was the golden years of pro-Israeli propaganda. I'm going to share with you a piece here that Drew Pearson, remember that name? Right? Drew Pearson made for the UJA or something, for Zionists. We're talking about, is there religious freedom in Israel? And you can see over here, it's total propaganda. Now, I'm not saying there wasn't religious freedom. What they're going to do is emphasize what I just told you. Religious freedom there was, correct? Religious freedom was. You want to be a Muslim, observe the Muslim religion, and go to mosque and pray and do all the religious things, it's not a problem at all. You want to be a Christian and celebrate Christmas and Easter and whatever it is a Christian, just stay out of politics. But he won't talk about that. He'll talk about, is there religious freedom in Israel? Because that's when an American audience would be interested in 1957 when this was made. I'll show you pieces of it. Go ahead. It's an objective presentation. He was a famous journalist. Can you make it a little louder?
It's not plugged in.
What's wrong?
It's not plugged in. Oh, can you plug it in?
Hold on, then freeze it, and let's plug it in so everybody can hear it. Wait a minute. Say, can you stop it?
Yep.
1 second. Go back to the beginning of his remarks. Can you make it work? It's worth seeing.
One of the chief questions I am asked about Israel pertains to freedom of religion. Is there freedom of religious worship there? Can there be that kind of freedom in a land which was founded as the homeland for one religious faith? Especially I would ask whether Jews and Muslims can live side together in peace? Well, those are natural questions because the older a country is, the harder it sometimes is to persuade leaders of ancient sects to tolerate other sects. And that is true in the United States as well as Europe and Asia. In Palestine under the Turks, it was even necessary to station Muslim guards at the tomb of Christ to prevent certain extreme Christian sects from stabbing each other as they came to do reverence to him who preached peace on earth, goodwill to man. For years, religious passion has been rooted deep in the land where Christ was born, a land which gave the world a great Hebraic philosophy, which has molded the thinking of almost every Western nation, a land which also contributed many of the prophets of the Muslim faith, which now dominates North Africa, the Near East, and parts of Asia. So to report on this complex problem, I went to Israel. The more I traveled through Israel, the more I found it to be a land of contrast. The Jewish tribes which returned to the Holy Land had brought with them their old habits, their ancient customs, their ways of praying to God.
This is totally staged. '50s.
But for the children, this problem does not exist. They work together, they play together, and they pray together. In the courtyard of the mosque, I met the TOUBI.
It's an Akko.
And about how many are there here in the city of Macon? And the Jews and the Arabs, how do they get along here in this city?
There are very good relations between the Arabs and the Jews.
Tell me about your court. What is its function?
In the first place, this court is for peace, to make everything possible to enforce peace between the rival parties.
And the schools that the Muslim and Arabic children go to, what are they like? What do they teach?
The Muslim boys or children, they go to the government school.
Reverends, what do you think it is that Israel needs most?
It's a Talmud Torah. Muslim. Afternoon school.
In the same courtyard of the mosque, Arab children were studying the Quran, Bible of the Muslim faith. Muslims even broadcast to the Arab population of Israel over the Israeli government radio station, reading from the Quran. And I could not help but feel that if the Arabs in the neighboring states outside Israel knew of the freedom inside Israel, the bitterness of the Arab Iron Curtain might begin to disappear.
Aye.
Church bells also ring out in Israel. Bells of many Christian churches, especially in Nazareth, the city of Christ's youth. Here they ring out in the Greek Catholic Church of Archbishop George Hatim.
What do you do? There's the politician. Jake, this was, he had extra things on there.
And he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. And as his custom was, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. I'm now reporting to you from Nazareth, home of Joseph and Mary, and where Jesus spent his childhood. I am standing in the ancient synagogue where Christ taught in his youth. It's one of the holiest places in Nazareth. An ironic twist of fate, Bethlehem, where Christ was born, is now in Arab hands. And the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, where he was buried, is also in Arab hands. But Nazareth, where he spent his boyhood, is in Israel.
Oh, boy, you got the wrong. I'm sorry about that. I was supposed to flip it. It's supposed to be the other part where he talks to Archbishop Hakim and says, oh, everything's great here. Understand? Anyway, this is propaganda. You understand what I'm saying? And by the way, it's the best propaganda. It's not a lie. This is not the whole truth. There is religious freedom in Israel. Nobody ever bothered anybody at all from practicing the religion. But if you want to talk about other issues, then that's a different story. How does this affect the Arabs? How does this affect them today? Right? Today, it's no joke. Look at this. This is the population distribution. Okay? You get the idea, as you can see. Here's where it's, these areas, 75% Arab population. Here's like 50%. It's a problem in Israel. You understand? And you have all this past that I just shared with you. That is something I'm going to talk about in the last lecture of this series. Good night. Huh? Yeah, right.
Yeah,
He converted, yeah, right.
what?
Ben-Uda converted to Christian.
I know somebody's liberal, but not.
No, I mean, what do you call it?
Well, yes, correct.
Thank you.
Kaya.
No, it's